All right, in this section, I'd like to turn to talking about some of the psychological as well as social factors that could impact our eating and weight. So last time in the last video, we talked about some biological effects on eating and weight and why it's so difficult to lose weight when you're dieting, and I'd like to talk about some psychological effects here as well. These are elaborated on a bit more in the Tracy Mann article that you read for this week. But a lot of this evidence comes from a really fascinating, but in some ways kind of terrible study. I would hate to be in this study that was conducted at the University of Minnesota back in the 1940s. And so for this study, they had 36 young, healthy men who volunteered for this, what they're calling a semi-starvation study. And this study was in part to look at how we could better help people who actually are starving, but also they were really interested in the psychology of what would happen to people when they were on a restricted calorie diet. And so in this case, the way that they operationalized semi-starvation is 1,600 calories a day. So that's significantly less than what the average person needs, which is 2,000 calories a day. And so again, these were also young people, so they probably was even less than what they were used to eating. Young, healthy men would probably be eating more like 2,500 calories a day. So definitely a restricted diet. And so what was really fascinating about this study is, right, so when they volunteered, they all had all different kinds of interests and activities that they were into. They were taking classes at the local university. But as they spent more time on this restricted diet, they became increasingly obsessed with food. They collected cookbooks. One of them planned to be a chef when this was over, collecting recipes, just really spending a lot of time thinking about food. And right, this really makes sense alongside some of the biological effects we talked about in the last video, where it would have been adaptive to orient oneself towards food and towards seeking that out when the body is in starvation mode. And so in this case, the body doesn't know that they're part of a study. It just knows it's not getting enough. It needs more. And so it's really orienting these people towards food. And so this is both a physiological effect, right, in the fact that we're having more activation in those areas of the brain that are orienting us, but it's also a psychological effect in the fact that we experience that, right? We experience a psychological phenomenon when there's activation in the brain. And so people have the experience of noticing more foods in their environment and being more oriented towards those. And so, yeah, they became obsessed with food. And what's really interesting is that you can see a similar effect occur even if people are only restricted to from a certain type of food, right? So if I ask you not to eat a certain type of food for some number of weeks, people will start to think more about that kind of food, crave that more. And fascinatingly, this can happen even for foods that people don't particularly love, right? You have to like it at least a little bit. If it's something you hate, this won't occur. But even I sort of am indifferent to broccoli, but if you tell people not to eat that for an extended period of time, they will start to have increasing thoughts about and desire for that food. So there's something about having a lack of something and the psychological effect of the restriction that leads people to then again orient more towards that, making it harder to resist that, right? So it gets harder and harder to resist the temptation, and so whatever we have restricted ourselves to in our diet becomes harder to keep to that. So now I want to turn to talking about a series of really classic studies, and they use a paradigm that we see a lot in eating research. And so I'm going to explain the general paradigm first and then go through the findings of each of these studies. There's 5 in total. So the general paradigm is you bring people into the lab, and the cover story here is that this is a taste testing study. And so participants are immediately divided into 2 conditions. Of course, they don't know this. And in one condition, they do an initial taste test where they have 2 different milkshakes, and they're told to rate those on creaminess, sweetness, and coldness. And the other group of participants, they don't do this initial task. They just do a filler task, so they don't have any milkshakes to start. Right? So this is the first task, and then the second step is that they are then left alone in a subsequent task to taste ice cream. And so they're left with a bunch of different ice creams that they can taste, and they're told to eat as much or as little as you need in order to make an accurate rating of, again, things like taste, sweetness, coldness, creaminess. And so you need to rate that ice cream. And so what they're interested in this basic paradigm, right, is what effect is having two milkshakes going to have versus no milkshakes on how much ice cream you eat afterward. And so you might expect that after you have two milkshakes, you might be likely to eat less ice cream. Maybe you're full, right? And as we'll see, this does occur for many people, but it doesn't occur on average for dieters. And so with this paradigm, we're going to look at the impact of eating, and so whether you've had two milkshakes or no milkshakes on how much people eat afterward, right? So if we can, that's our outcome that we're interested in. How much ice cream did they eat in this unrelated second task of rating ice cream? So we can just break down this study design a little bit more, right? So this is what we call a 2x2 design, right? So participants are either dieters or non-dieters, right? And so this is a measured variable. We don't assign them to this. You bring them into the lab and you ask them, are you on a diet or are you not on a diet, right? So people who are not engaged in any type of restriction in their diet are in the non-dieters condition. And then you're assigned to either have these 0 shakes or 2 shakes, right? And that's in that initial piece. And then we see how much ice cream you eat. And that's our dependent variable. And so, as I noted before, right, you would expect, I think your hypothesis would be that after you've had 2 milkshakes, you're probably pretty full and you're going to eat less ice cream. And indeed, this is what we see for non-dieters, right? So they eat significantly more grams of ice cream when they have no milkshakes compared to when they have 2 milkshakes. But interestingly, we actually see the opposite pattern for dieters. They don't eat all that much ice cream when they've had 0 milkshakes. That's actually about the same amount that the non-dieters had after 2 milkshakes, right? So when they were full, that amount that they ate after that, that's the same as dieters eat, just under normal conditions of the ice cream, right? It makes sense. They're on a diet. They don't want to eat that much. But after they've had 2 milkshakes as the first part of the study, dieters actually eat significantly more grams of ice cream, up to the amount that non-dieters ate when they were hungry, when they hadn't had any ice cream. And so, you might think, why is this going on? And so if this were a live class, I would pose this question to you all to think about for a second. Why do you think dieters would engage in this type of behavior? Why would they eat more after already having some if they're on the diet? So you might think about that for a second. And the hypothesis is, right, I'll answer that for you now, is that it's because they feel like they've broken their diet, right? There's a psychological effect going on here. I've already been sort of forced to, as part of this study, have these 2 milkshakes, which are presumably fattening and not healthy, right? I've broken my diet. Now, what the heck? I might as well eat more ice cream. Whereas those dieters who started off the study not having any milkshakes, they're still on their diet, and so they're still regulating themselves around the ice cream when they have a chance to eat that. So this is this first study that they show here. And then we want to examine just a few other effects, right? So this is just generally what happens for dieters and non-dieters, but let's introduce some other variables. So just to look more at whether this is truly a psychological effect of breaking your diet, let's say that we'll make these milkshakes actually non-fat, right? So technically the person isn't really, breaking their diet. Particularly this was done a while ago when most diets were low-fat diets. Now we have a different idea of dieting, but for the sake of these studies and the psychological effect, right now these milkshakes aren't technically breaking the diet, but the participants don't know that, right? They're still labeled as typical high-fat milkshakes. And so what we see here is the exact same pattern that we saw on the previous slide, right? We see the same effect, whereas non-dieters eat more when they've had none. Dieters eat more when they have had 2 milkshakes. And so again, it's this idea that even though they technically, calorically, fat-wise, haven't broken their diet, they perceive that they have. And so it all goes out the window and you eat more ice cream and you don't regulate in the way that you might normally. Now let's switch that around and say, let's label the milkshakes non-fat so that the dieters know that they're, healthy and they're not breaking their diet, but actually they're high fat, right? So they're still, equally unhealthy to the ones that they had in the first study, but the dieters think that they're healthier, as do the non-dieters, right? Everyone thinks that they're healthier, they're non-fat, but the dieters do the same. The non-dieters do the same thing as they've always done after 2 after no milkshakes, they have more than after 2 milkshakes, right? They're still, because they're actually full fat, right, they're going to still be hungrier after none versus after 2. Whereas here, the dieters, we see a different pattern than we've seen previously, where in both cases, they still regulate their eating, right? They eat as little as they did in the 0 milkshakes condition previously and here, right? So both conditions look the same now. And so from this, we can reaffirm our hypothesis from before that this really is a psychological effect about, breaking your diet. So here, again, it's not a actually low-fat milkshake. It's just as filling as the one in the first study, but now that they think it's low-fat, it's not ruining their diet in the same way, and so they don't turn to dysregulated eating after that. Now let's look at a social factor, right? So, there's lots of reasons why we might not regulate our eating, and I think many of us can resonate with this, that we might eat more when no one's watching, particularly if we're used to restricting our eating. And this is indeed what they find in this iteration of the study. So what they do here is, in all the past ones, the people were left alone in that room with the ice cream for the taste test, right? So they were totally on their own, and presumably no one was even measuring how much ice cream they ate. Of course we were, that's the variable in the study, but they were not aware of that, right? They thought that the measure was how much they liked the ice cream and their ratings of it. But now we leave the experimenter in the room with them during the ratings. And so now they're being observed. And what we see here is that, again, this doesn't have any effect on non-dieters. They still show the exact same pattern of having more ice cream when they've had no milkshakes and less when they've had 2. So they still eat in the exact same way. Whereas dieters here, again, we see the same pattern we saw on the last slide, just like we saw when they thought it was a low-fat milkshake, which is that there's no dysregulation, there's no increase in eating after these 2 milkshakes this time, presumably because someone's still in the room observing them, and you don't want to break your diet in front of other people. Social factors play a large impact on our eating behavior, and so these people also the experimenter was aware that they were dieters in this study, and so they wanted to keep that diet, right? They wanted to maintain that in front of this other person, and so they were less likely to eat more after breaking their diet, even though they should have had the same kind of psychological threat there. Now let's look at one more. Let's look at just the impact of stress, right? So now we're taking the milkshakes out of the equation. So instead of having 0 versus 2 milkshakes, we're going to stress these dieters and non-dieters out. And so they do a typical, Trier stress task. They have you give a scary speech in front of a panel of people who just kind of stare at you very seriously, and sometimes they tell you to speak up or give you really negative looks or make negative comments. And so this is a very stressful task. And so they have people go through this, and then they look at what's the impact of that stress on eating. What we see here is, on average, for the non-dieters, they eat the same amount regardless of the stress or no stress. So stress doesn't seem to have an overall impact at the sample level on eating and the amount of ice cream that people ate. Whereas for the dieters, when they got stressed, they were more likely to break their diet and eat more ice cream, as opposed to under no stress when they ate less and less than the non-dieters, which again makes sense, right? They're on a diet, they're trying to eat less, and they do eat less than non-dieters when they're not under stress. But when you stress people, then they become more likely to engage in eating, particularly if they are restricted eaters, right? And that's what we're seeing here. You may be curious about the fact why there's no difference among the non-dieters, and we're going to get to this a little bit more in one of the future slides in this same lecture. But some people who are non-dieters, when they're stressed, they become hyperphagic and eat more, and some become hypophagic and eat less. And so this is at the overall level for non-dieters, and so they're probably washing each other out here, right? And so on average, under stress, non-dieters are eating no more than they are when not stressed, whereas for dieters, because they're all restricted eaters, they're much more likely to become hyperphagic under stress and eat more. And so this is what we're seeing here. So just to sum up, that was 5 studies that were all similar but showed different pieces to this puzzle here. And so I just want to summarize those. And so first, for non-dieters, eating seems to be more influenced by your actual level of hunger, right? It was influenced by how much you had previously eaten more than by these other cues that were introduced, like the cognitive around whether you thought this was high fat or low fat, social, whether someone was in the room or not, or emotional factors like stress, right? So these didn't have an impact on the non-dieters. It seemed to be more about having the milkshakes, right? So they ate less after the milkshakes. It doesn't matter if they think they're high or low fat. It doesn't matter if someone's in the room, and it didn't matter if they were stressed. Whereas essentially the opposite occurred for dieters on average. They were influenced more by these cognitive cues, so about what they thought about the milkshake, the social cues, and the emotional factors than they were by hunger or by what they'd eaten previously, right? So they ate more after the big milkshake or after 2 milkshakes. They eat more if they think that the milkshake is high fat, right? Again, this is indicating that they broke their diet. And they also, but they don't eat more, right? They break their diet, but they don't do so if there's another person in the room with them, right? And so this isn't showing that social influence on eating. And they eat more after stress, right? They're more likely to become hyperphagic and eat more food after being stressed. And jumping back to a previous lecture, right, we learned about anti-fat stigma and the backfiring impact of that, right? That people who were overweight after reading a stigmatizing article ate more. One of the potential mechanisms underlying this is the stress of stigma, right? People felt stressed out after reading that they might not get a job and all about all this stigmatizing thing that relates to their identity, and so therefore that was stressful, and that could be the reason why they then ate more. But the good news is that we're not totally doomed, right? In this study, we've stressed them out, but then we've put ice cream right in front of them, right? That's setting people up for failure. I mean, and this is an important thing to do and to show, because it does show that it is different for dieters and non-dieters, and the amount that we restrict our eating impacts how we respond to those cues in our environment. But what happens if we put different cues in that environment? And so I want to talk about that here with the effect that we refer to as attentional myopia. And this is a fancy term that just refers to the fact that when we're cognitively depleted, right? When our resources are low, maybe we're tired, maybe we're distracted, maybe we've been stressed, and so we're sort of worn out, right? We don't have a lot of attentional resources to apply to different things. And so when that occurs, we're most likely to focus on whatever's the most salient feature in our environment, right? The most obvious things. And so in the past studies, that was, the ice cream in the room that you're supposed to taste test. But what's really cool is that this cognitive load can lead to either less or more eating among dieters, depending on what cues are available. And so what they do in this study that I want to talk about here is first they operationalize cognitive load by having people memorize either a 1-digit number. That's super easy. Like you're just like, oh, that's that number. My number's 5. It's not hard to do. For most of us anyway. I'm pretty bad at remembering any numbers, but certainly much easier than remembering an 8-digit number. And so that was high cognitive load. They were asked to keep on, mentally rehearsing that number so that they could remember it later for the experiment. And so this means that they had less resources to devote to other things, right, while they're running those numbers through their head. And then what they do is they have second manipulation, where some participants, the room that they are doing the study in has, posters on the wall of tasty milkshakes, right? Like the kind that they would have in like a diner, right? Of like yummy sundaes and milkshakes and things like that, right? So they're making eating and unhealthy cues really salient. I don't know why everyone in eating research is so obsessed with milkshakes. I guess that's sort of one of the quintessential images of something unhealthy. Or they're put in a room where diet is made salient. So there's pictures of scales and like an apple on the wall and a stethoscope, right? All the things that you might see in like stock images for health and diet. And so if you do a Google search for that, you'll see similar images pop up. And so they have either the images like that around the room or the milkshake salient. Right, and what's interesting is participants don't even really, they ask them afterward, like, do you know what the manipulation is in this study? And nobody thinks it's about the posters in the room. They just think that those happen to be there because it's a research lab and, stuff's on the wall. People are weird. Psychologists don't necessarily have great art on their walls. And so that wasn't even necessarily picked up on at a conscious level, right? But it is salient in their environment, these cues. So then what we want to see is what happens for people under high cognitive load in these two different conditions compared to people under low cognitive load, right? So they have either the milkshake salient or the diet salient, and then everybody is then asked to afterward engage in a taste testing task with milkshakes. And so then they look at how much of this they consume, how many grams of milkshake they consumed following this. And what we see is for people with low cognitive load, people who just memorized a one-digit number, they eat the same amount of the milkshake regardless of which type of cues are present, right? So these salient cues do not influence them when they're under low load, right? So presumably in this case, right, you're more able to pay attention to what your body wants and needs and not to these cues in the environment. Whereas when people are under high load, if the milkshake was salient based on the images around, then they were then they had significantly more milkshake, whereas if the diet cues were salient, then they had significantly less milkshake, both in relation to each other and also in relation to what they did under low load, right? So this bar is significantly greater than these two, and this one is significantly less than these two. And so what this is showing us is that under high load, whatever is most salient is having a greater impact on your behavior. And so in our food-rich society, to bring back in these social factors, right? So in many places, the most salient cues are the big McDonald's M that you drive by on the way home from work. Or for me, it's that box of cookies I put on the counter, right? And so if we think about the fact that we're particularly at the end of the day, when we come home, likely to be depleted and stressed, if we can set ourselves up as much as possible as individuals to have cues to remind us of our goals, that can be helpful. But also as a society, right, we can think about ways to change the kinds of cues that are available to people. So there's been, actually, I think I'm going to get to this on one of the future slides, but I'll just mention it now, right? There's been a lot of interest in how we can rearrange, for example, food that's in cafeterias for children to make the salient cues be healthy ones, to pick healthy foods. But it's not about putting kids on a diet per se, but diet just refers to what we eat, right? And we want to have a diet that's healthy. We want to be eating nutrient-rich foods as opposed to lots of processed, nutrient-poor foods. And so creating and shaping environments so that the salient cues are the healthy ones is particularly important given how stressed and frazzled everyone's lives are. And so this is important to keep in mind, right? It's not just that we're doomed when we're stressed to always eat more. There are things that can be done to shift the cues in the environment, either at the individual or at the societal level, to try to help us to respond differently when we're stressed and depleted. So I'm going to end that section here, and we'll pick back up in talking more about stress and weight.